Hello, I'm Michael Hainsworth. Federal and provincial governments are too casual about the costs of public debt. That's the determination by the CD Howe Institute after spending this spring reviewing the economic costs of high public debt on future generations. Interest payments currently make up about 14% of federal tax revenue, and revenue that goes to debt servicing is money that isn't going back into the economy or the pockets of Canadians. Meet Andrew Coyne. The Globe and Mail columnist warns public debt, fewer people of working age, and a slowing GDP per capita are a perfect storm waiting to batter a sluggish economy.
We're spending close to $500 billion on program spending at the federal level alone. When they initiate these reviews, I think the most recent one, they came back and they were very proud that they had found, I think it was $1.5 billion in savings on a $500 billion budget. It's preposterous. We're now spending more real dollars per citizen by far than we ever have in our history. If this government were only spending as many real inflation dollars per citizen as it did in its first year in office, it would be spending $50 billion less than it is now.
And this is Trevor Tombe. He's an associate professor of economics at the University of Calgary and a research fellow at the School of Public Policy.
The importance of long-term thinking, long-term planning, and sticking with those plans, in a disciplined way is more important now than ever. There's a lot of long-term challenges that we can see coming. Demographics and aging population is a source of financial pressure, especially to provinces, that we won't be able to avoid, and we need to start planning for that.
Andrew and Trevor join us now. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Good to be with you.
The 2023 Fall Economic Statement, Andrew, predicts the debt to GDP ratio falling for 30 straight years. What's the worry?
Well, if you assume 30 straight years of uninterrupted economic growth, if you assume that the federal government continues to make spending restraint that it has not shown in the past, one of the things with this government, more so even I think than previous governments, is they continually revise upwards their spending figures every 6 months or so, and not by small amounts, but by tens of billions of dollars. So their spending forecasts are essentially unreliable. They've never met a spending increase they didn't agree with. And as I say, there's so many ways in which inclement events in a particularly risky period in history, we've seen in the recent years, a pandemic here, a war there, can really blow your numbers off. So it's not that we're heading for a crisis immediately in federal finances, but we are putting ourselves at needless degrees of risk, putting ourselves out on a limb where if the worst does happen, then we really have to scramble.
So this budget, just in 2024, just for example, is spending this year about $25 billion more than what last year's budget projected we would be spending this year, and about $58 billion more than what budget 2022 was projecting, again, for this year. So we're ratcheting up to this higher level. Instead of a $40 billion deficit for this current fiscal year, had we just maintained the plans we put in place in 2022, we'd have an $18 billion surplus. And so these longer term projections, I do think they're quite valuable exercises. They tell us where we're pointed in terms of expenditure pressures. It's especially valuable for the provinces. And I think we'll circle back to that, where there is some real long-term dangers, I think, ahead. But they do assume policy is fixed and in place. So not just that economic growth continues at some rate and that interest rates are at some long-term level, but that policy doesn't change. And so they're informative about where current policy is pointed, but especially as Andrew noted, with the current government, policy does change consistently, and the direction of that change in terms of the fiscal impact has really only been in one direction for the federal government.
And the trick, and they got away with this for a few years where people were taken in by it, was that the forecast, the spending curve is always very flat, just gently slopes upward, like 1 or 2% per year. And everyone goes, oh, spending's under control. And then they didn't notice for a while that every time they issued a new forecast, the whole curve shifted up by $10 or $20 billion. I think by now people have wised up to this, but it worked for them for a time.
Tell me, though, about ringing this alarm bell in this economic environment, because the Bank of Canada has cut the overnight lending rate twice now to 4.5%. The Institute's Monetary Policy Council is calling for the BOC to further cut in September to 4.25%, and then an additional 100 basis points by this time next year. Does that help ease the burden?
It certainly eases the amount that anyone who has debt, whether it's an individual, a company, or a government, would tend to pay to service that debt. And so interest costs will be helped with lower interest rates than would have otherwise have been the case. And they've risen quite a bit. Federal interest costs are, as you noted, now well over 10% of revenues. Nearly 2% of Canada's overall economy is federal debt charges. And that is up from about 1.2% or so prior to the Bank of Canada increasing interest rates. But that's projected to, or that's kind of baked into the forecast, if you will. So the government, when it puts out its budget, does have anticipated reductions in interest rates. Despite that, we're going to be allocating just shy of 2% of GDP to interest costs for the foreseeable future. And so the falling interest rates is being compensated, if you will, by rising debt levels, and the two are kind of a wash. So the burden of the overall debt charges on Canada's overall economy is not going to fall, even if interest rates do.
Yeah, it helps for the same reason that it hurt on the way up, which is that there's still a substantial portion of federal debt that is in short-term debt. You remember a few years ago, we were being told everything's fine for two reasons. One is interest rates are at historic lows, and we're going to lock in those low interest rates by moving all of our debt into long-term securities. Well, neither of those actually holds. The interest rates are no longer, needless to say, at historic lows. And as I say, they did not succeed in moving as much as I think they claimed they were going to into longer-term securities, so into longer-term debt instruments. So we are, so that hurt a lot. We're now at $50-odd billion in interest payments every year, up from, what was it, 20-something a couple of years ago. But yes, if we get interest rate relief, because of some of that is in short-term debt, we'll get some relief on the interest costs. But we're still well in excess of 10 cents on the dollar in interest costs. And while that's certainly nowhere near where we were in the 1990s, if you'll recall, we were at 36 cents on the dollar. It's still higher than is prudent, higher than anyone should be comfortable with.
Well, that's where I wanted to go next, because 2% of GDP, 10 cents on the dollar. Any average Canadian would love to only be in debt or servicing their debt at that percentage rate. But participants in the recent Institute conference on Canada's debt problem advised the federal and provincial governments to cut our share of debt to GDP by 10 percentage points from where it is today. Give me some insight, Trevor, into how much wiggle room that gives us.
Sure. So think about where we were prior to COVID. Federal debt was about 30% of GDP then. And so a drop of 10 percentage points from where we are now would represent returning to pre-COVID levels of debt. And we should think about public debt as a shock absorber. It is there in difficult times to cover increases in spending that are sometimes necessary. COVID was, of course, exceptional, but during normal recessions, you're going to see an increase in spending just naturally from things like employment insurance increases, maybe people taking on early retirement that drops the amount of revenue the government has as well. Unemployment rises, so income tax revenues fall as well. So you see natural increases in deficits during recessions. And then ideally, when you're in an economic expansion period following that, you have surpluses that you can use to then return debt levels back down again. So think about that as a kind of golden rule for public finances, increasing debt during bad times, bringing it back down to prepare for the next inevitable negative shock. And without returning debt levels to that pre-COVID levels, then we have a higher level of risk exposure than we did before. And I think it's fair to say that the world is even potentially more volatile and uncertain than it was several years ago, which might present an argument to have an even bigger cushion, decreasing federal debt levels more than 10 percentage points. And I think the problem, though, is is magnified at the provincial level, especially when we look out a few years from an aging population, rising healthcare spending that is just not sustainable for most provinces. And the trajectory there is to have increasing levels of debt. And I think part of what we would naturally see is that the federal government is itself going to have to take on some of the financial burdens, if you will, of pressures on provincial governments. And maybe not across the board, but you naturally see increases in health transfers, for example. It's hard to avoid that pressure sometime, as we saw last year. But some provinces, Newfoundland and Labrador comes to mind in particular, might face challenges that are potentially beyond their individual ability to manage. And there's going to be some federal involvement there in helping overcome those challenges. And we need to prepare for that. And that does mean ensuring that the federal debt levels are brought back to a level that could absorb these challenges.
Well, Andrew, give me some insight into the rainy day component to this conversation that Trevor's brought up here. Over the last 60 years, Canada has seen 5 downturns, one every 12 years or so. How much time do we have left to get our financial house in order before the next crisis? And to an earlier point about maybe we need to be saving even more because we are in even more unprecedented times, what do you see as the key risks to the economy over the course of the next few years?
Well, the short answer to both those questions is no one knows. Nobody knows when the next crisis will come. Nobody knows exactly what shape it will take. But if I go back to 1975, from 1945 on, we paid. Pardon me, our dog has just decided to. I guess you can edit this out. Toby.
He's got some opinions on monetary and fiscal policy.
I've trained him well. Hey, Tobe, can you, Toby? Can you hang on 1 second?
Yeah.
Let's try that again. If I go back to 1975, we paid down debt after the war, after World War II, for 30 years, and I think we got it down to below 20% debt to GDP at the federal level. And that was right before all hell broke loose, and it eventually wound up topping 65%. That's just federal debt, and that's just net debt. Now we're back down now in the 30s and 40s, so it's obviously a lot better than it was then. But if you're only looking at federal debt, first of all, and we'll get into the provincial debt situation, then you're not merely looking at the situation in the whole. There's only one taxpayer, as they always say. If you're only looking at net debt, that's a consideration as well, because the reason there's such a gap between our net debt and our public debt, our gross debt, is that we've got so many assets built up in our pension funds. But if you got into a fiscal crisis, it's not like you could suddenly stop paying people's pensions. So it's debatable whether that distinction really matters. When you look at the gross debt levels, we're actually in the top ranks of countries. We're not one of the better off countries. So that's a concern as well. But to come back to your question, you just don't know what kinds of crises you could face. But let's put it this way: we know that as just one fiscal pressure that we're under, that we've got to make substantial increases in defense spending, like tens of billions of dollars. Well, that alone that's a known component. But supposing war breaks out, I mean, we're in a time when that is actually a genuine consideration, whether a major war is going to break out between the powers, in which Canada would inevitably be implicated. You can't factor that out. We've got a known situation of increasing pressures to deal with climate change. Well, supposing the climate situation gets a lot worse, and that imposes costs on Canada as well as other countries. So those are just things we could reasonably foresee, but there's just things that can come down the pike that you never expected. Nobody thought we would see such a spike in inflation in recent times as we did, if you went back 3 or 4 years, because nobody predicted the pandemic. And look at what's that done to our fiscal numbers. So you've got to kind of plan for the unexpected, and that means giving yourself some fiscal wiggle room.
So then if the solution is to prioritize expenditure reductions, why is there a call to revamp the federal government's evaluation methods for determining what programs need to be scaled back or eliminated altogether? Are we simply not swinging the axe effectively?
Keep in mind the scale of the federal government. Its overall program spending this year is nearly $500 billion. And so there's a lot of programs and a lot of activities that it does, serving needs that might have existed in the past that potentially no longer do, or policy design maybe not as effective as was originally envisioned. And so regular and serious reviews of programs, eliminating what works and scaling up what does work, is necessary. And we haven't seen a really deep and rigorous across the board spending reviews since the 1990s. I mean, governments do it a little bit here and there, but that's an important part that should be a regular aspect of managing the public purse, just to make sure that what we're doing is effective in terms of achieving the goals that the program has, but also cost effective, not spending more than is necessary to achieve those goals. And I think partly what we see, and it's not just the federal government, lots of governments do this, is we mentioned earlier on layering new spending on top of old prior spending plans, moving on to the next new thing rather than ensuring that what was implemented before is tuned up optimally. So we're kind of getting distracted by implementing new program after new program.
What is considered in Ottawa a restraint exercise is frankly laughable. As Trevor mentioned, we're spending close to $500 billion on program spending at the federal level alone. When they initiate these reviews, I think the most recent one, they came back and they were very proud that they had found, I think it was $1.5 billion in savings on a $500 billion budget. It's preposterous. We're now spending more real dollars per citizen by far than we ever have in our history. If this government were only spending as many real inflation dollars per citizen as it did in its first year in office, it would be spending $50 billion less than it is now. So to give you one area of potential review, we're now spending over $40 billion a year, closing in on 50 in a few years, $50 billion a year on business subsidies. The economist John Lester, who worked in the federal government, knows where the bodies are buried, in a study for I think it was the University of Calgary School of Public Policy, found that you could eliminate about 80% of that. That 80% of that spending is either at best of no value or at worst actually harmful to economic efficiency, economic growth. That's just one area of the federal spending that could be usefully reviewed in a much more substantial way. But I'll just say, in addition to that, I really don't think what's required is just an exercise in, let's spend less money on paper clips, let's be sort of more efficient across the board. I think what's required is much more definitive decisions about what is the role of government. What do we need the government, and particularly the federal government, to be doing? And if it's doing things that don't fit into that definition, then by definition, it should be getting out of those things. And I think that kind of more substantive, purpose-driven exercise would yield you much larger savings than just, sort of fewer vodka rations all around.
Yeah, just to reemphasize that point about business subsidies, I mean, the reason for a government to provide a subsidy on economic grounds would be to address a market failure. Potentially there is maybe an external benefit of some activity. This is usually how we think about subsidies to research and development, say. And what John Lester did in that paper that Andrew cited, which was through the School of Public Policy here at the U of C, so thanks for that plug, he found that about 1/3 of that $50 billion in subsidies federally is not there to address a market failure. 2/3 could in principle be, but of the 2/3 that even in principle could be addressing a market failure, he found that 2/3 of that fails a cost-benefit test. And so while in principle you could imagine it being an appropriate subsidy, is just too large relative to the benefits. So really thinking hard about whether or not these programs make sense, actually boost productivity rather than detract from it, is important not just for the federal budget itself, but for the broader economy.
I want to pivot a little bit here because we've sort of touched on this ever so slightly. We've been speaking primarily about the federal government. Ottawa is being urged to help avert a provincial fiscal crisis by transferring tax room rather than cash. Andrew, you're a proponent of this. What does that mean and how would it look?
Well, first of all, let's just consider this, that we've been talking about mostly the federal government to now, and the federal finances are in absolute clover compared to where the provinces are. This is the real issue, and it's not immediate or short term, it's longer term. But you start with the provinces. Some of the provinces already have rather high debt loads, in excess of 40% of debt to GDP. Talking about provinces like Manitoba, Newfoundland, even Ontario and Quebec. Ontario and Quebec, and we're in relatively good times economically. So that's troubling to begin with. Now you layer on top of that where they're at with their healthcare system. We have, as we're discovering, and I think is now incontestable, a radically inefficient healthcare systems. We have a great achievement in terms of having public healthcare, but we are not spending dollars wisely within that. And so you've got a situation where even today, provinces are spending typically nearly half of their own source revenues on that one department. And even then, with the extraordinary increase in spending on healthcare that we've seen in recent years, we're still seeing longer wait times than ever, three times as long as they were 30 years ago. So we're in a fix with that. Now you layer on top of that the aging of the population. I mean, the baby boomers are really only getting going in terms of retiring from the workforce. So you're going to see much greater increases in healthcare spending as a result of that in years and decades going forward. So rule of thumb, your consumption of healthcare dollars doubles for every 10 years over the age of 55. So you've got great increase in costs, fewer people of working age to pay those costs. Well, maybe we can still manage if we get faster economic growth to cover those revenue losses, except the economy has taken just this moment in history to return historically low levels of growth, which seem inclined to continue for decades to come. So it's the provinces where the situation is really dire. When you look at forecasts and the parliamentary budget officer issues numbers every year. Trevor has done his own numbers at the Finances of the Nation website. There's your second plug, Trevor.
I appreciate it.
These things are hostage to whichever assumptions you plug into it. But basically, you've got provinces 25, 30 years out that are looking at debt to GDP ratios of 50, 60, 70% of GDP. And if you'll remember, Saskatchewan had a debt to GDP ratio in the 40s when it nearly hit the wall in the 90s. There were differences in the situation, but it tells you that the provinces are potentially heading for real troubles. And where it really becomes worrisome to me is not the aggregate overall average numbers for the provinces, but if you get one or two provinces that really get into trouble, you could get knock-on effects where the markets start speculating, well, if they're in trouble, what's the next province to fall? And they start marking up their interest rates, and you get into these debt cycles where the higher interest leads to the higher costs, lead to higher debts, lead to higher interest rates, et cetera. So we really don't want to get into that situation. So yes, to come back to your question, the provinces have been crying wolf for decades that they're not getting enough money from the feds. But I always remind people the story of the boy who cried wolf ends with the wolf devouring the boy. The wolf is actually here now, and it's in the form of this demographic and fiscal crisis that are facing the provinces. And it is, for once, it is valid to say the provinces have fiscal needs that require transfers of funds from the feds.
Where you don't want to give them more money.
Well, where I differ with the status quo is what we've been doing in recent decades is just transferring them cash. And what that means is you get two levels of government claiming credit for spending the same dollars twice. And you get a finger pointing as to we're not getting enough cash from the feds, and it's all their fault if there's something wrong with your healthcare system. The feds say, no, the provinces are spending it unwisely, et cetera. The transfer should take, in my view, and many other people's views, should take the form of transfers of taxing power and capacity, so that the provinces, yes, have more fiscal capacity, have more dollars, but are also more responsible. It's their tax dollars that they're raising from their taxpayers and have to answer to their taxpayers for, and they can't just go blaming Uncle Ottawa if things go wrong. So it's the coupling of increased fiscal capacity with increased responsibility for the results that I think is key. And I'll just say one more thing on top of that is, I do think, given the capacity for one or two provinces that are behaving irresponsibly to wreak fiscal havoc for the rest of them, we need to start talking about coordinating debt burdens and debt levels amongst all the provinces together, that not just having everybody going off on their own and with disregard for the consequence for the other. We need to start talking about a collective process for managing our debts.
Well, let me just pick quickly up on that point about the tax point transfer. I mean, in addition to the great points that Andrew noted, it also provides provinces with more flexibility to administer and deliver public services, more scope for experimentation. Especially in recent years, we've been seeing an increasing use of conditional transfers on the part of the federal government. And so part of a tax point transfer to eliminate some of these cash transfers is also eliminating conditionality, allowing provinces more scope to try to do things a little bit differently. And I think we do, in health in particular, need to allow for more experimentation in terms of how we operate health systems in Canada, because that long-term challenge that Andrew noted, a huge part of it is because historically, the cost of delivering healthcare rises more quickly than the cost of other goods and services throughout the economy. So we have this healthcare specific rate of inflation, if you will. And if we can shrink the growth of health spending by 1 percentage point, which is huge, it might not sound like a lot, but that right there is almost all of the long-term challenge that provinces face overall. And so the tax point transfer, think of it as something where there's less direct involvement in program spending decisions by the federal government and leaving it to provinces. But it would come with cash transfers too. We couldn't have a federal tax point transfer alone because the value of those points are very differently. PEI would get less per person than Alberta would because the size of the tax bases are so different across provinces, because the strength of provincial economies are so different. So we'd also need to couple it with a change to how we approach equalization, for example.
Right, because it sounds like the federal government would simply give irresponsible provinces enough rope to hang themselves. So you want to blame us for your financial problems? Here, you take care of the tax, you collect the revenue, and if you've got a problem, it's your fault. Crickets.
Yeah, it would make it much more clear to individuals, a point Andrew noted about who's responsible for what. So aligning the revenue with the expenditures makes accountability much clearer than is currently the case, I think.
Can I just maybe just slightly disagree with Trevor on the question of conditionality up to a point? I mean, I certainly agree that while we might have been leaned more in the direction of conditional transfers in the past when we were just setting up these programs, we wanted to have some commonality, some degree of a national focus to them. I think given the stress the provinces are under, the fiscal stress, I think the bias has to be much more now, as Trevor says, in favor of allowing them more experimentation room, more room to try things that might not have previously been countenanced. I would only make a couple of points on that. One is, I still think you want to have guard against balkanizing the federation through things like denying portability of benefits. I still think you want to make sure that people can move from province to province and still be able to keep their benefits as they go. So that's a concern to begin with. And secondly, there's a lot of problems with the way this federation is functioning, particularly on things like the common market. And we're in a moment where the provinces are the demandeurs. The feds have the money and the provinces want it. I think I don't see anything wrong with the Fed saying, okay, if we're going to do a big revamp of fiscal federalism, we are going to put a condition on the table, and that is you've got to come up and belly up to the bar on things like the common market. That we're not going to run this crazy system with hundreds of interprovincial trade barriers at the same time as we're giving you all this tax room. I think there's room for a grand bargain, in other words, where we deal with not only the social union but also the economic.
Based upon the conversation we've had here today, what's the one thing you want the viewer or the listener to walk away with?
That the real problem is that the provincial level, the feds are running irresponsible levels of deficits of debt. That's true. But the real potential crisis is in the longer term that you get one or more of the provinces running into fiscal difficulty, and it winds up turning into a fiscal crisis for all of us. Just think about the chaos that Greece caused within the European Union. That the European Union is a fiscal union is a monetary union without a fiscal union. That's also Canada. So we've got to be thinking about the longer term potential for chaos.
And Trevor, final thought from you?
the importance of long-term thinking, long-term planning, and sticking with those plans, in a disciplined way is more important now than ever. There's a lot of long-term challenges that we can see coming. Demographics and an aging population is a source of financial pressure, especially to provinces, that we won't be able to avoid, and we need to start planning for that. We approach budgets normally just as one-year documents, sometimes less, and then plans change once we get into the fall with the mid-year updates, and then they change again with the following budget. We need to really start thinking for the long term and sticking with those plans.
Gentlemen, thank you for your time and insight today.
Good to be with you.
Trevor Tombe is an associate professor of economics at the University of Calgary and a research fellow at the School of Public Policy. Andrew Coyne is a columnist with the Globe and Mail. For more on the Institute's research on the impact public debt has on Canada's economy and its citizens, visit cdhowe.org. I'm Michael Hainsworth. Thanks for joining us.
You've been listening to the C.D. Howe Institute podcast with Michael Hainsworth. Subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify. The C.D. Howe Institute is an independent, not-for-profit research institute whose mission is to raise living standards by fostering economically sound public policies. The Institute is widely considered to be Canada's most influential think tank and a trusted source of essential policy intelligence, distinguished by nonpartisan, evidence-based research and subject to definitive expert review. Visit cdhowe.org and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thank you.